for the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. Hereafter perhaps some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood, I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute, which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion, which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident, or through affection, they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night returning home, much intoxicated, from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when, in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth, The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, jinn-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties, or sentiments, which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or a silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown, through an open window, into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin, or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame, and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed, in a high degree, that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber, in this manner, to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own, that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful. It had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death! And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man, fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the hole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation, I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this, I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a freeman. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily, with a cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. I sat in my car that evening, engine off, keys dangling uselessly in my hand. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly yellow, like eyes watching me back. I didn't want to go in. I never did anymore, not since things had started fraying at the edges. Dinah's temper, Sue's quiet defiance, and that damned cat weaving through it all like a shadow I couldn't shake. Through the living room window, I could see Dinah pacing, arms crossed tight across her chest, waiting for me. My stomach twisted, a sour knot of dread that had been growing for weeks. I knew what was coming. I always did. The air inside the car felt heavy, pressing against my temples. I rubbed my eyes, trying to push back the dull ache that had settled there, a constant companion lately. Stress, I told myself. Just stress. But my hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, and a faint heat prickled under my skin, like a fever that wouldn't break. I'd been tired for months, bone-deep, soul-weary tired. But it was worse now, ever since Sammy had come into our lives. I didn't want to think about that. Not yet. I forced myself out of the car, the cold February air biting at my face as I trudged up the driveway. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, and Dinah's voice hit me before I'd even stepped inside. "You're late," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. She stood in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted by the harsh fluorescent light behind her. "Where have you been?" "Work," I muttered, shrugging off my coat. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I'd lingered in the parking lot at the grocery store for 20 minutes, staring at a bag of cat food in the checkout line, enriched with taurine for cognitive function. The words had stuck with me for no reason I could name, a splinter in my mind. I didn't tell her that. She wouldn't care. Dinah didn't wait for me to settle. "That cat," she said, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous register I'd come to dread. It's the only thing she cares about. Not me, not us, just that damned cat. I sighed, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders like damp earth. Dinah, she's 11. Kids get attached to pets. It's normal. Normal? She barked a laugh, short and bitter. You think it's normal for her to sit there stroking it all day, whispering to it like it's her best friend? She barely talks to me anymore, Jerry. Barely looks at me. And you... She pointed a finger at me, her eyes narrowing. You let it happen. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. I'd seen it too. Sue's devotion to Sammy, the way she'd curl up with him on the couch, her small hands running over his sleek black fur while he purred that deep, rumbling purr. Too deep, I'd thought once, though I'd shaken the idea off. It was just a cat. Just a stupid cat. We start tonight, Dinah said, her voice firm, final. The cat goes out at night, and soon he goes for good. I stared at her, the ache behind my eyes flaring. You mean, get rid of him? Yes, Jerry, get rid of him. She turned away, busying herself with the dishes in the sink, but I could feel the tension radiating off her. It's not healthy. She's obsessed. We're doing this for her. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The TV hummed in the background, some news anchor droning on about rising reports of erratic behavior among pet owners. Something about stress, maybe, or strange patterns. I grabbed the remote and switched it off before it could sink in. I didn't need more noise in my head. That night I found Sue in the living room, just like always. She sat cross-legged on the couch, Sammy sprawled across her lap. His fur gleamed like oil in the dim light, and his eyes, those unnerving yellow-green eyes, watched me as I stepped closer. I stopped short, a wave of dizziness washing over me. The room tilted for a second, and I pressed a hand to my forehead, blinking hard. The feverish heat under my skin flared again, and that pressure behind my eyes tightened, like something was pressing from the inside out. You okay, Daddy? Sue's voice was soft, too calm for a kid her age. She didn't look up from Sammy, just kept stroking him, her fingers tracing the curve of his spine. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just tired. Long day. She nodded, but her lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sammy purred louder, the sound vibrating through the room, sinking into my bones. I locked eyes with him, couldn't help it, and the dizziness hit again, sharper this time. For a split second it felt like I wasn't standing there anymore, like I'd slipped somewhere else, somewhere dark and endless. Then it passed, and I was back, staring at a cat that stared right through me. Sue, I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. Your mom thinks maybe Sammy should sleep outside tonight. Her hand stilled on his fur. She looked up at me then, her gaze steady, unblinking. You can't put him out, Daddy. It's just for one night, I said, but the words felt flimsy, like they'd crumble under her stare. Don't you know? She whispered, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. Know what? She didn't answer, just smiled again, that same strange smile, and went back to petting Sammy. My head throbbed, and I turned away, feeling sweat bead on my neck despite the chill in the room. Later in the kitchen, Dinah cornered me again. Did you tell her? Yeah, I said, rubbing my temples. She didn't like it. Of course she didn't. Dinah snorted, crossing her arms. She's lost in that thing, Jerry. You You ever hear about those cat ladies? The ones who hoard 50 of them, talking to them like they're people? It's not just crazy. It's science. I read about it. Parasites or something. Messing with their heads. I barely listened, the ache in my skull drowning her out. So, what? You're saying Sue's got some kind of cat parasite? Dinah scoffed. I'm saying she's obsessed, and that thing is making it worse. You promised you'd help me, Jerry. Don't back out now. I nodded, too tired to argue. Fine, I'll do it. But as I climbed the stairs to bed that night, my legs heavy and my vision blurring at the edges, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deeper than Dinah's rants, deeper than Sue's attachment. Sammy's eyes flashed in my mind, bright and knowing, and the dread in my gut coiled tighter. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just about a cat. It was something bigger, something I couldn't see yet, waiting in the dark. I stood in the living room that night, the clock ticking past midnight, my hands hovering over Sammy. He lay sprawled on the couch, his black fur catching the faint glow of the lamp. Sue watched me from the doorway, her small frame still, her face unreadable. I didn't want to do it. Every fiber of me screamed to leave him be, to let him stay curled up there, purring that too deep purr. But Dinah's voice echoed in my head. The cat goes out tonight, and I'd promised. I'd always been weak against her, bending until I broke. I scooped him up, expecting a fight, claws, something. But Sammy didn't struggle. He went limp in my arms, heavy and warm, his yellow-green eyes locking onto mine. The pressure behind my eyes spiked, a needle-sharp pain that made my vision pulse. Black, then light, then black again. For a heartbeat, I forgot where I was, what I was doing. The room blurred, and all I could see were those eyes, endless and knowing, pulling me somewhere I didn't want to go. I shook my head, hard, and the world snapped back into focus. Sue's stare burned into me from across the room. I stumbled outside, the cold air slapping my face as I set Sammy down on the grass. He didn't move, didn't run, just sat there, staring up at me. My hands shook as I stepped back, the dizziness lingering like a hangover. Behind me, Sue's voice drifted through the open door, soft and clear. You shouldn't have done that, Daddy. I locked the door without looking at her, my chest tight. The ache in my skull throbbed in time with my heartbeat. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Dinah's steady breathing beside me a mockery of peace. The feverish heat under my skin wouldn't fade, and my thoughts kept circling back to Sammy's eyes, Sue's words. Then it happened. A sharp screech ripped through the silence, tires screaming against asphalt. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and stumbled to the window. A car's taillights vanished around the corner, red streaks in the dark. And there, in the middle of the road, a small, dark shape lay still. My stomach dropped. I knew what it was before I even pulled on my boots. I didn't wake Dinah. I didn't want her to see me like this. Shaky, unsteady, already grieving something I couldn't name. The street was quiet when I stepped outside, the air thick with that late-night chill. Sammy lay there, his body crumpled but oddly intact. No blood, no mess, just stillness. I knelt beside him, my breath catching. His fur was warm under my fingers, too warm for something dead. And then I heard it, a low, vibrating hum, faint but unmistakable. The purring hadn't stopped. My hands jerked back, clammy and trembling, and I pressed them to my face, trying to steady myself. The fever flared, hot and insistent, and the pressure behind my eyes pulsed harder. "Jerry." Dinah's voice cut through the night, sharp and impatient. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "For God's sake, bury it." I didn't argue. I grabbed the shovel from the garage, my movements sluggish, like I was wading through mud. Behind the barberry bush, I started digging. Each scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last, my grip slipping on the handle. Once I nearly dropped it. My fingers just gave out. No warning, no reason. The hole grew, shallow and uneven, and that strange déjà vu hit me, a flicker of memory I couldn't place. Had I done this before? Buried something out here? The thought slipped away as fast as it came, drowned by the throbbing in my head. When it was done, I tipped Sammy's body into the hole. The purring stopped, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore over the ringing in my ears. I covered him with dirt, my vision swimming, and trudged back inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Sue was waiting in the kitchen when I got there, sitting at the table with a glass of milk. Her eyes flicked up to me, calm and steady, and I froze. I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell her Sammy was dead, couldn't watch her face crumple. So I lied. He ran away, I said, my voice hoarse. "Sammy's gone, kiddo." She nodded, sipping her milk. "I know, Daddy." The words chilled me, but I didn't press her. I couldn't. I shuffled upstairs, collapsing into bed beside Dinah, who'd already gone back to sleep. But I couldn't rest. My head pounded, my skin burned, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sammy staring back at me. Hours later, Dinah rolled over, her voice cutting through the dark. "You just couldn't do it, could you?" she said, a smirk in her tone. Couldn't even tell her the truth. Weak, Jerry. Always so weak. "Leave it," I muttered, turning away. "Maybe I'll tell her myself," she went on, relentless. "She ought to know Sammy's buried under that bush. Might snap her out of this nonsense." "Dinah, stop." My voice cracked, misery seeping through. She laughed, low and mean. "You've been spacey as hell lately, you know that. Forgetting things, stumbling around like you're in a dream. Maybe Sue's not the only one who needs to snap out of it." I didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. I'd noticed it too. The way my thoughts slipped, the way my hands fumbled simple tasks. Stress, I'd told myself. Just stress. But deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. Then it started. A low, vibrating hum crept into the room, faint at first, like a distant engine. I froze, my breath catching. Dinah sat up beside me, her smirk gone. "What the hell is that?" The sound grew louder, thicker, filling the air. It wasn't just a purr, not anymore. It was two frequencies clashing, one deep and resonant, the other higher, almost electronic, grating against my nerves. My head throbbed in time with it, the pressure behind my eyes swelling until I thought they'd burst. Worse, it didn't come from outside. It was inside me, inside my skull, vibrating through my bones. "Jerry?" Dinah's voice trembled now, her hand gripping my arm. "Where's it coming from?" I couldn't speak. I stumbled out of bed, my legs unsteady, and lurched to the window. The yard was dark, the barberry bush a shadowed hump. Nothing moved, but the sound didn't stop. It grew, twisting into something wrong, something alive. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. It was too deep, too close. and then from the kitchen below I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping, like small feet on the tile. My blood ran cold. Sammy was buried. I'd seen him dead. I'd put him in the ground myself. But the purring didn't lie. The purring deepened that night, swelling into something monstrous. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a force, pressing against the walls, making the windows tremble. I sat up in bed, sweat soaking my shirt, my breath shallow and ragged. Beside me, Dinah threw off the sheets with a curse, her face twisted in anger and fear. She stormed to the window, yanking the curtains back. "It's coming from the backyard," she snapped, her voice tight. "But there's nothing there. Nothing." I didn't need to look. I knew where it was coming from. My eyes drifted to the glass, past her shoulder, to the barberry bush hunched in the dark. It was shaking, not swaying in the wind, but trembling, like something alive was clawing its way out. The purring rolled through me, a tide of vibration that sank into my skull, my chest, my bones. I wiped my face, my hands slick with sweat, and the fever flared hotter behind my eyes. Dinah didn't wait for me to say anything. She grabbed her robe and headed for the stairs, her steps heavy with purpose. "I'm ending this," she muttered. "Whatever the hell it is." "Dinah, wait." I tried to follow, but my body betrayed me. I swung my legs off the bed and then, nothing. My muscles locked, rigid and useless, like they'd been severed from my will. I couldn't move. My arms hung limp, my legs refused to budge. Panic clawed at me, but even that felt distant, muffled by the heat flooding my skull. The purring thundered now, a relentless hum that drowned out everything else. Through the window, I saw her march into the yard, her silhouette stark against the night. She stopped near the bush, her head tilting as if listening. The trembling intensified, branches snapping, and then a shape uncoiled from the dark. It was Sammy, but not Sammy. Larger, distorted, wrong. His body stretched too long, his legs bent at angles that didn't fit. His fur rippled like something writhed beneath it, and his eyes, those bottomless voids, swallowed the moonlight. Dinah froze, her hands half raised, her mouth open in a silent scream. He pounced. It was fast, too fast. 1 second she stood there, clumsy and unsteady, like she'd forgotten how to run. The next, she was down, Sammy's weight pinning her to the dirt. I saw it all through the glass. Her arms flailing, her legs kicking uselessly, then a sickening twist as she hit the bush. A crack split the air, sharp and final, and she went still. Sammy crouched over her, his head low, that warped purring vibrating through the night. I collapsed. My body gave out entirely, crumpling to the floor beside the bed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The sound was inside me now, crawling through my skull, a living thing burrowing deeper. My vision pulsed. Black, then light, then black again. And all I could do was lie there, helpless, as the night swallowed her. Morning came slow and gray, the sky heavy with clouds. I stood outside in a daze, barefoot on the cold grass, watching the police mill around the yard. My shirt clung to me, damp with sweat, and the throbbing behind my eyes had grown into a full, relentless pressure. I barely felt the chill. I barely felt anything. "Looks like she sleepwalked into the barberry bush," one officer said, scribbling in his notebook. He was young, his face smooth and unbothered. Struggled, got tangled up, fell, broke her neck. Freak accident. His partner nodded, peering at the ground where Dinah lay covered with a sheet. Happens more than you'd think. People don't realize how dangerous those bushes can be. I listened, silent, my hands shoved deep in my pockets. They didn't ask me much, just the basics. Time of death. Had she been acting strange? I mumbled answers, my voice flat, and they didn't push. They didn't need to. Their story fit, neat and tidy, and I didn't argue. I couldn't. The purring hadn't stopped. It hummed through me, steady and low, a constant thread stitching the morning together. They loaded Dinah into the coroner's van, and the officers tipped their hats, murmuring condolences before driving off. The street went quiet again, just me and the house and that sound nobody else could hear. I wiped my forehead, my skin slick despite the cold, and turned back inside. The fever burned hotter now, a furnace in my head, but I didn't mind. It felt right somehow, like it belonged there. Sue sat at the kitchen table when I walked in, her hands folded around a glass of milk. She looked calm, too calm, her small face serene in a way that made my stomach twist. I stood there, feverish and unsteady, watching her. She didn't cry. She didn't ask about her mother. She just sat, waiting. The police said it was an accident, I said finally, my voice rough. Your mom, she fell last night. She's gone. Sue nodded, her eyes lifting to meet mine. They were clear, steady, untouched by grief. I know, Daddy. I swallowed, the words sticking in my throat. You okay? She smiled then, a slow, quiet smile that didn't belong on a kid her age. I told you, Daddy. Sammy went back into the night. She sipped her milk, her gaze never wavering, just like I said he would. The room tilted, and I gripped the counter to steady myself. The purring swelled, louder now, sharper, vibrating through my skull like a second heartbeat. It wasn't coming from outside anymore, not from the yard, not from the bush. It was inside me, woven into my thoughts, my breath, my blood. I stared at Sue, her smile widening just a fraction, and a cold certainty settled over me. She knew. She'd always known. I sank into a chair across from her, my hands trembling, my vision blurring at the edges. The fever pressed harder, a weight I couldn't shake, but I didn't fight it. I didn't want to. The police were gone. Dinah was gone. And whatever had happened out there in the dark, it was done. Sammy had come back, not just for her, not just for revenge. He'd left something behind, something growing. Sue finished her milk and stood, pushing the chair in with a soft scrape. She walked past me, her footsteps light, deliberate, and paused at the doorway. "Good night, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft as a shadow. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The purring filled the silence, endless and alive, and as she disappeared up the stairs, I sat there, sweating, listening to it hum inside my head. It wasn't going anywhere. Neither was I. Outside, the barberry bush stood still in the gray light, its branches heavy with secrets. And somewhere, deep in the night, Sammy waited. Part of it, always part of it, spreading what he'd brought with him.